Welcome to the FDA QRC session on the important regulatory updates from 2019 on good clinical practice. This session is being provided as a recorded learning. You may request a certificate of completion using the instructions located on the last slide. We are pleased to provide technical content to the industry, and should you have any questions, please reach out using the contact information provided at the end. My name is Eric Zirzo, and I'm one of the project managers with FDA QRC. I have over 19 years of experience in good clinical practice in academic medical centers that included the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, university hospitals, and Case Western Reserve University. My focus has been in regulatory affairs, compliance, operations, and project management. In today's session, we will be covering the following topics: the revised common rule, what has changed, and how it's affecting definitions, IRB submissions, exemptions, as well as exemption categories, and informed consents, including new elements and key information. We will also be reviewing revisions to the Investigational New Drug Safety Report, as well as a high-level review of bioresearch monitoring activities. The revised common rule, what changed and how it's affected definitions, IRB submissions, exemptions, exemption categories, and informed consents, including new defined elements as well as key information in informed consents. The changes being discussed from the revised common rule would only apply to sites conducting research within the United States. An institutional review board would be the equivalent of an independent ethics committee. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and 18 other federal agencies are signatories to the federal policy for the protection of human subjects, known as the Common Rule. All research supported by any of the Common Rule agencies is subject to the regulations that we will be discussing in today's presentation. The changes to the revised Common Rule brought two revised definitions for 2019. The first being human subjects and the second being research. Human subjects. The regulatory definition of human subjects remains substantially unchanged in the revised Common Rule. The definition has not been expanded, but the common rules have added language relating to using, studying, or analyzing an individual's biospecimens or generating identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. The definition also now specifies what is meant by an identifiable biospecimen and includes a requirement for Common Rule departments and agencies to re-examine the meaning of identifiable private information and identifiable biospecimen. In addition, the revised definition includes a provision requiring a Common Rule department and agency to assess whether there are analytical technologies that should be considered by investigators to generate identifiable private information. The definition for research has been expanded to list activities that are specifically deemed not to be research. The revised Common Rule does not apply to the following types of activities because they do not meet the regulatory definition of research. The first being certain scholarly and journalistic activities. The second, public health surveillance activities. The third, collection and analysis of information, specimens, or records by or for criminal justice or investigative purposes. And lastly, certain authorized operational activities for national security purposes. The revised Common Rule changes of 2019 also provided us with new additional oversight for when continuing reviews are required and no longer required. The revised Common Rule removes the requirement for continuing review for minimal risk research and for greater than minimal risk research that is in long-term follow-up or data analysis only, unless the research is regulated by the FDA. When the new rules would have gone into effect, new minimal risk research will not automatically undergo a continuing review by the IRB unless it is regulated by the FDA. The IRB may require continued review for special circumstances, such as studies involving conflict of interest, IRB reliance, or prior compliance concerns. For greater than minimal risk research projects which are in long-term follow-up or data analysis only, this change would have gone into effect on the 21st of January 2019. Even when continuing review is not required, investigators remain responsible for updating the IRB about adverse events and other anticipated problems. seeking IRB approval for changes to personnel, protocol amendments, recruitment materials, and informing the IRB when the research is completed. Researchers are still required to submit all their amendments as well as unanticipated problems to the respective IRBs. The Investigator's Research Integrity Office should initiate a check-in at 1 year and ask, is the study still open? Have any amendments not yet been submitted? And have any anticipated problems not yet been reported? IRB continuing review will not be required if the research is eligible for expedited review, the research is subject to limited review under the new exemption categories for 2 and 3, or the research previously approved by the full board, more than minimal risk research, has progressed to the point that it only involves, again, data analysis or accessing follow-up data only. The Common Rule changes also provided additional guidance for review by a single IRB. The changes to the revised Common Rule now require that all institutions located in the United States that are engaged in cooperative research conducted or supported by a Common Rule department or agency rely upon approval by a single IRB for the portion of the research that's being conducted within the United States. This means that all federally funded or supported non-exempt research requires a single IRB review for collaboration. The only exception would be with studies currently being funded by the Department of Justice. These changes began in January 21st of 2020. The NIH policy. This is distinct from the Common Rule requirement and applies to most grants and contracts submitted to the NIH on or after January 25th of 2018 that involve multi-site non-exempt human subject research. The policy defines multi-site research as a subset of collaborative research that will now require the use of the single IRB. Under exemptions, there are revised and new exempt review categories. There are 3 different levels of IRB review: exempt, expedited, and full committee. The new Common Rule broadens the types of research that may be determined to be exempt from IRB review. The existing exempt categories have been revised, and a brand new exempt category for benign behavioral intervention has been added. Benign behavioral intervention allows investigators to collect behavioral data. Benign behavioral interventions is when the research interacts with study participants and is deemed as harmless. Some of examples could include playing an online game, asking a participant to solve a puzzle under various noise conditions, or even allocating a nominal amount of money between themselves and someone else and having them make a determination of the amount to provide. Federal exempt categories are supported through the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 46, Protection of Human Subjects, Subpart A, 46.104, Exempt Research. The full text of the new and exempt categories and requirements is available with your local IRB. Under the revised Common Rule changes of 2019, we will be looking at exempt research categories 1 through 5. Exempt research category 1 applies to research in established or commonly accepted educational settings that involve certain normal educational practices, such as research on instructional techniques already in use or classroom management. Exempt research category 2 is research that only includes interactions involving educational tests, surveys, interviews, or observation of public behavior, including visual or auditory recordings of adults. The exemption excludes interventions or collection of biospecimens. Exempt research category 3 is a new category. It's research involving benign behavioral interventions with adult subjects if the subjects prospectively agree to the intervention and information collection. It allows for some minimal risk interventions to be able to qualify for exempt determinations. Exempt research categories 2 and 3 have a limited IRB review. Categories 2 and 3 now allow for the collection of sensitive, identifiable information, provided that the IRB conducts a limited IRB review to evaluate whether there are adequate privacy and confidentiality protections in the study protocol. Under exempt research category 3, benign behavioral interventions, it has to be brief in duration, harmless, painless, not physically invasive, and not likely to have a significant adverse lasting impact on the subjects. and the investigator has no reason to think that the subjects will find the interventions offensive or embarrassing. Children are not permitted as subjects. Intended deception is not permitted unless the participant prospectively agrees, which would need to be outlined in the informed consent. An example of the consent language could be, specific details about this study may be withheld from you at the outset. However, the full details of your participation will be provided upon the conclusion of your participation. We will be looking at Exempt Research Category 4 and Exempt Research Category 5 under the revised Common Rule changes of 2019. The Exemption 4 would apply to secondary research use of identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. One change in the revised Common Rule is that the private information and biospecimens no longer have to be in existence or prior to the start of the clinical research study. Under the revised rule, for example, a research study that proposes to analyze samples or information that will be collected for clinical purposes in the future could qualify for this exemption if it meets at least one of the applicable provisions. An example may be chart review, where the researcher records a patient's age, sex, diagnosis, and treatment without being able to link back to the patient. Under Research Category 5 applies to research that is designed to study, evaluate, improve, or otherwise examine public benefit or public service programs if the research is conducted by a federal department or agency. This has been expanded to include research that is also supported by a federal department or agency. For example, would be funding through an NIH grant or a Department of Health and Human Services award. There is also a new requirement for the federal entity conducting or sponsoring the research to publish a publicly available list of the projects that are covered by the exemption before the research begins. Exemption Category 5 projects include but are not limited to internal studies by federal employees, studies under contracts of consulting agreements, cooperative agreements, or grants. Revised exemptions according to the Common Rule changes of 2019. What do you have to do now? The IRB was able to apply new exemptions on the 21st of January 2019, meaning that if your exempt application was reviewed on or after that date, the new rules would have applied. Exempt research approved prior to the 21st of January 2019 was subject to current rules. The new exempt rules only affect new studies as well as existing minimal risk studies that were approved via expedited review that wouldn't be converted. All the IRBs were well prepared in regards to the training, correspondence, and templates that would institute the changes. From my perspective, everyone was well prepared for the changes. The ruling and execution were where most of the challenges existed. Many of the questions that investigators were proposing to the IRB about the new definitions, language, and exemptions were still being brought to full board IRB settings since there was a variation on the interpretations. Many of the IRB members did not feel comfortable answering these types of questions independently and continued to add them to agendas, causing major delays as well as lengthy IRB meetings. This also caused major delays in responding to investigators and severe delays in opening and amending studies. The general requirements for the informed consent have been changed and updated as well with the changes to the new Common Rule. Researchers are now also being asked to provide key information at the beginning of the informed consent to help promote autonomy and ensure prospective subjects receive the information needed to make an informed decision. Changes to the informed consent general requirements now include: first, the informed consent must give the prospective subjects the information that a reasonable person would want to have in order to make an informed decision. Secondly, the information must be presented in a way that facilitates an understanding of why a patient might or might not want to participate in a clinical trial. Third, the informed consent form should not simply list isolated facts, but instead should help people process and understand the complex information being presented to them. The key information. There are 5 elements that encompass key information. They include the study's purpose, the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives, and they now must be provided at the beginning of the consent form. New consent elements have been added and expected to be in consent forms that are approved after the 21st of January 2019. They include future use of identifiable private information for identifiable biospecimens, as well as clinically relevant results and whole genome testing. A waiver of the informed consent is no longer necessary for screening and recruitment procedures as long as the IRB approves the procedures as part of the protocol. The common rule also provides us with the broad consent, which is optional, and it's also an alternative consent process that applies to the storage, maintenance, and secondary use of identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens for future use. The FDA and NIH are also now requiring us to post consent forms for studies that are funded by common rule agencies. The revised common rule requires that for any clinical trial conducted or supported by a common rule department or agency, one consent form must be posted on a publicly available federal website, such as clinicaltrials.gov. After recruitment closes and no later than 60 days after the last visit, the consent form must have been used to enroll subjects in order to satisfy this new provision. In this slide, you will see an example of a key information template that can be included in informed consent. Approved informed consents that are over 4 pages long now require a concise summary of information at the beginning that would include the study activities, the risks, and the benefits presented first in the consent form. This key information about the study must be provided at the beginning of the consent. The information should be provided in sufficient detail, organized, and presented in a way that helps the subject think about why they may or may not want to participate. The 5 elements that encompass the key information, according to the revised common rule, again are the study's purpose, the requirements of the study, risks, benefits, duration of the participation, as well as alternatives. The key information is vital to the patient's decision on whether they want to participate in the study or not. The consent process is rather lengthy, and providing this information early and in a concise format, patients are able to comprehend what's truly needed to participate and what's being asked of them for the study. We will look further into the new consent elements that have been brought on by the revised common rule changes of 2019. We will look at each element and why these changes could have been implemented. All these changes are welcome and provide patients with more insight into what is being collected, how it's being collected, and what it will be used for, and who will have access to it, and who ultimately may profit from it. Collection of identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. In your informed consent, it should include a statement indicating whether identifiers may be removed and de-identified information or biospecimens may or may not be used or shared for future research. An example of identifiable information would include a patient's name, social security number, or date of birth. Use of biospecimens. In the informed consent, it should now include also a statement indicating whether biospecimens will be used for commercial profit and whether subjects will share in the profit. Patients have the right to understand where and what the specimens are intended for and to be able to make the informed decision. Patients also have the right to know if they will share in the profits as well. Clinically relevant results. The informed consent should include a statement indicating clinically relevant results and if they will be returned. Whenever tests are conducted, patients need to know about the test and if results will be given at any point during a clinical trial. Whole genome sequencing. A statement indicating whether the research will include whole genome sequencing should also be included in an informed consent. Why are all these changes being included? These changes could be attributed to the immortal cell lines of Henrietta Lack. Miss Lack's famous cell lines were taken without consent during a doctor's visit to Johns Hopkins in 1951. Miss Lack had malignant tumor cells on her cervix, and they collected the tumor cells without her knowledge. To the amazement of the scientists in the lab at the time, Miss Lack's cells thrived outside the human body and grew every 20 to 24 hours versus other cell lines that expired when they were taken out of the body. There are countless therapies, vaccines, cancer treatments, as well as in vitro fertilization that have come from Miss Lack's cell lines. There are currently 17,000 U.S. patents that involve her cell lines and are still being used and sold today. Many of the new consent elements we discussed with the common rule changes could be a result of cases similar to Henrietta Lack's. Miss Lack did not know that they collected the cells, what they would have been used for, how long they would have been used, or if someone was actually making a profit from her cell lines. We will now look at the waiver criteria, documentation, and broad consent changes that were brought on by the Common Rule changes of 2019. A waiver of informed consent for the secondary use of identifiable private information or biospecimens must justify why the use of identifiers is necessary to be able to carry out the research study. For the IRB to approve a waiver or alter the informed consent for the research involving identifiable data or biospecimens, the IRB must be able to find that it's impractical for the research to be conducted with the identified data or the biospecimens. Wavering or altering the requirement for documentation of the informed consent. The IRB may approve a request to waive or alter the requirement to document informed consent for minimal risk research in communities or in cultural groups where the signing of documents is not the norm. There must be an appropriate alternative mechanism or documentation that the consent was actually obtained and what information was discussed. Broad consent. This is a new optional alternative consent process for use only for storage, maintenance, and secondary use of identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens for future research. Prior to the challenges with the Common Rule research, researchers had to obtain an IRB waiver of consent or remove all personal identifiers so that the research would not involve identifiable private information. Implementation of a broad consent must take place at an institutional level and requires a mechanism to track each individual's choice, whether they opt in or opt out. There are substantial obstacles for institutions who want to implement broad consent. Each individual's choice must be tracked regarding who did and who did not consent, and it is not yet clear what should happen if an individual makes different choices at different points in time, adding further complexity to the consent process. Again, a broad consent should go to full board and be approved, and the process should be documented. Revisions to IND Safety Reporting submissions. An IND is an investigational new drug application, and this portion of the GCP session will cover the changes to the safety reporting. To truly understand the revisions to the IND Safety Reporting submission, first, you have to understand what constitutes an IND Safety Report. What constitutes an IND Safety Report would be serious and unexpected suspected adverse reactions, findings from animal or in vitro testing, findings from other studies, as well as an increased rate of occurrence of serious suspected adverse reactions. So why change the format? According to 745A, Subpart A of the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, sponsors of commercial INDs now must submit IND safety reports through the FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System database, also known as FARS. This can be done in two ways. First, through the Electronic Submission Gateway, ESG, or through the Safety Reporting Portal. Who's ultimately responsible for submitting IND safety reports? Sponsors hold the ultimate responsibility to notify the FDA and all participating principal investigators of any potential serious risk from clinical trials. Why are they responsible? Sponsors of clinical trials are required to submit IND safety reports per 21 CFR Part 312.32. The existing submission process for an IND safety report was labor-intensive, it lacked reportability, and it was an older technology that was challenging to navigate. Investigators had to convert their safety report documents initially into a PDF file format and then convert it to the Electronic Common Technical Document, or ECTD. ECTD is the standard format for submitting applications, amendments, and supplements and reports to the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and Center. The new submission process for IND safety reporting involves investigators now completing the International Code of Harmonization's E2B XML document package, which will then be uploaded to the Food and Drug Administration's Adverse Event Reporting System. The advantages of now using a FARS database is the FARS database is reportable. It's a far more efficient submission process using newer technology. It also allows tracking within the database and is available to the public. The FARS database is also compliant with 21 CFR Part 312. The following table is meant to provide guidance to sponsors on where to submit their IND safety reports. the original or existing Electronic Common Technical Document format, or the new FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, also known as the FARS database. For the Electronic Common Technical Document format, sponsors should be submitting findings from other studies, findings from animal or in vitro testing, or increased rate of occurrence of serious suspected adverse events. For the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, or FARS, sponsors should be submitting a single occurrence of an event that is uncommon and known to be strongly associated with drug exposure, one or more occurrences of an event that is not commonly associated with drug exposure but is otherwise uncommon in the population exposed to the drug, or an aggregate analysis of specific events observed in a clinical trial that indicates those events occur more frequently in the drug treatment group than a concurrent or histological control group. The following slides provide a high-level review of the BIMO Metrics released in May 2019. Annually, the FDA provides bioresearch monitoring inspection matrix by fiscal year. This inspection data covers all aspects of the FDA's BIOM program, which would include clinical investigators, IRBs, sponsors, bioequivalents, and good laboratory practices. The following graph is for applications and inspections overseen by the FDA. The BIOM program is an agency-wide program that collects on-site inspection and data audits designed for public reporting of FDA-regulated research. The monitoring activities listed in the graph represent the domestic data from 2009 through 2018. The sponsor data for GCP would include the sponsor, CRO, and sponsor investigators that received inspections. Between 2017 and 2018, there were 14 more inspections conducted. In the last year, clinical investigator and sponsor investigations increased, while the remaining inspection categories decreased slightly. The following graphs represent clinical investigator inspections as well as international clinical investigator inspections. The data was collected from 2009 through 2018. The FDA has been conducting international inspections since 1955. International inspections continue to increase in both complexity as well as frequency to cover all products subject to regulation by the FDA. According to the data, the inspections domestically are conducted at a 3-to-1 ratio versus international inspections. The number of inspections has slightly increased from 2017 to 2018 during this reporting period. The previous graphs provided us with domestic investigator inspections as well as data for international clinical investigator inspections from 2018. In the cases of both the domestic as well as the international clinical investigator inspections, majority of them required no action. The domestic investigator inspection for 2018 did demonstrate an official action being required at 1.5% versus the international clinical investigator inspections, which had 0%. The following graph provides us with data of frequency of clinical investigator-related deficiencies based on post-inspection correspondence that have been issued. In domestic versus foreign inspections for clinical investigators, protocol and records continue to be the focus of the deficiencies. In 2018, the domestic clinical investigator deficiencies for protocol was at 29% versus foreign clinical investigator deficiencies at 14%. Records, on the other hand, for domestic clinical investigator deficiencies were at 14% for domestic versus foreign clinical investigator deficiencies for records at 10%. Data in these graphs show us the categories for warning letters that have been issued. The warning letters that have been issued since 2009 have been predominantly issued to clinical investigators. The three most common reasons that investigators are issued warning letters is for failure to personally supervise clinical investigations, failure to maintain accurate case histories, as well as failure to obtain informed consent. This graph provides us with data in regards to warning letters as well as NID POE letters, or Notice of Initiation and Disqualification Proceedings and Opportunities to Explain. As you can see, since 2009 to 2018, these numbers have generally decreased. In 2009, there were 18 warning letters issued, compared to only one warning letter issued in 2018. In 2009, there were 5 NID POE letters issued, compared to only 1 NID POE letter issued in 2018. There was a slight increase from 2013 to 2014 in warning letters, going from 5 in 2013 being issued to 11 being issued in 2014. In general, the decrease in the warning letters may be a result of the FDA increasing its interactions and communications with companies to resolve issues and bring more timely and effective corrective actions than actually issuing a warning letter. The following graph is warning letters based on program area from data collected from 2009 through 2018. The program area for clinical investigators has had the highest warning letters at 18 in 2009 to 1 in 2018. Other areas of consideration would be sponsor-investigated GCP as well as institutional review board for warning letters issued from 2009 to 2018. This slide provides us with GCP-related sponsor and/or contract research organizational inspections in 2018. The amount of GCP-related sponsor and/or contract research organizational inspections has continued to increase since 2014. From 2017 to 2018, there were 12 additional inspections, with majority of these inspections not requiring any action. As you can see in the graph highlighted in the orange, the number of sponsor and/or investigator GCP-related inspections has tripled since the last reporting period, going from 5 being reported in 2017 to 16 in 2018. For additional information from the information that was presented in today's session, please visit the International Council of Harmonization website or the U.S. Food and Drug Administration website. From today's session, we're providing you with 2 hyperlinks. The first hyperlink is for a Google survey. Please provide us with any input or suggestions for future education sessions. The second hyperlink is to receive a certificate of completion. Thank you and have a good day.